January 12th, 1888. The thermometer on the porch post outside Eric Tuomi's general store, 4 miles north of Tower, Minnesota, read 42 degrees below zero at sunrise and had not moved by 9. Up in her small cabin on the rise above the South Fork of the Vermilion River, Aino Niskanen had risen at 6, the way she always rose, and had checked the small German thermometer hanging on a nail in the tile face of her kakelung. 71 degrees. The last real fire she had laid in the firebox had gone to coals at midnight. It was now 9 hours later, and the cast-iron damper she had closed before sleeping was still warm enough to leave a mark on her thumb if she pressed it. Outside, the air was the kind of cold that does not move. No wind, no snow, just present, total, and motionless. 8 miles south of her cabin, in the McKinnon claim along the Embarrass Road, Auntie McKinnon was splitting fence rails by lantern in his dooryard because he had burned through the last of his cordwood the previous afternoon. His daughter Eiley, 3 years old, was coughing the tight, dry cough of whooping cough in the corner of the main room, and the air inside the McKinnon cabin, with the fire as high as Auntie could get it, on green pine and rails, stood at 9 degrees above zero. Aino did not yet know any of this. She knew only what her own thermometer told her, and what the window glass told her, which was that the inside surface of every pane in the cabin was free of frost, on this morning of all mornings, the morning that the men at Tuomi's store would still be talking about 30 years later, when they tried to explain to their grandchildren what real cold had been like before the iron mines and the rail lines had brought down the price of stove oil and changed what a Minnesota winter could do to a family living too far from town. The kakeloon against the north wall of her main room was warm to the touch, from floor to ceiling, the green and dust-rose tiles holding the heat the way her late husband had told her they would hold it, the way his master in Tampere had told him they would hold it, the way Carl Johan Kronstedt had drawn out for the Royal Council in Stockholm in 1767, when the Swedish forests had been cut to within an inch of catastrophe by 20 years of war and ordinary peasant burning, and a thin, careful man with a thin, careful instrument had spent 2 years working out, on paper and in clay, what a stove ought to do if firewood were to be respected the way oil and silver were respected. Eric Tuomi, who had sold her the lumber for the firebox surround the previous autumn, had told a young Finnish bachelor from Hancock, on the same porch where the thermometer now read 42 below, that the widow Niskanen had brought broken pottery across the ocean for sentimental reasons. He had said it kindly. Aino was a decent woman, in his opinion, and had paid her bill on time, and had not asked for credit when her potato crop came in thin in 87. He had not said it to hurt her. He had said it because he had grown up in Pottery, on the Gulf of Bothnia, where the houses were small and the stoves were cast iron, and the kakeloon was the kind of thing one read about in the papers from Stockholm, not the kind of thing one lived with. The bachelor had nodded politely and looked over Eric's shoulder at the road that led up to her cabin, and had stored the comment somewhere in the back of his mind for later use, the way men of 22 store such comments. His name was Arpo Heikkilä. He would become, by the autumn of 1888, one of 3 men in St. Louis County who had paid Aino Niskanen for instruction on how to build a kakeloon of his own. But that was 9 months away, on the morning the thermometer read 42 below. What Eric Tuomi and Arpo Heikkilä and most of the men on the porch did not know about Aino Niskanen because she did not advertise it, and the records of such things were thin and in a language none of them read, was that the kakaloon she had brought across the ocean had not been broken when she packed it. It had been disassembled, tile by tile, in the small brick and stove yard her husband Mikael had operated on the southern edge of Tampere from 1878 until the spring he died. 243 glazed earthenware tiles, each one marked on the unglazed back with a small runic number in soot and fish glue ink, in the old hand that Mikael's mother had taught him, the same hand her own grandfather had used in Ilomantsi to mark his timber for the sawmill. The tiles had crossed the Atlantic in 3 pine crates packed with rye straw, had come up by rail from New York to Duluth, and by wagon from Duluth to Tower, and had spent the summer of '86 stacked under canvas in the corner of her dooryard, while she and her son Vilho cleared the half-acre where the cabin would stand. She was 47 years old that January. She was 5 feet and 3 inches of straight-backed Karelian stillness, with dark hair gone almost entirely grey at the temples, but still black at the crown, kept braided and pinned beneath a plain cotton kerchief that she did not remove indoors except to sleep. She spoke a Karelian Finnish that the Pori men and the Vasa men found slightly old-fashioned, with hard consonants and a tendency toward longer vowels, and which her own children had begun, very gently, to soften at the edges in the year and a half since they had landed at Hanko on the steamer that carried them away from everything they had ever known. She had 3 children, Vilho, 12, who had inherited his father's narrow shoulders and his mother's stillness, and who had spent the autumn of '86 and most of '87 helping her with the masonry and the carpentry and the slow, patient assembly of the stove that the men at Tuomi's store referred to, when they referred to it at all, as the doll's furnace. Lisa, 9, who could not yet read English, but could read Finnish and the runic numbers on the backs of the tiles, and who had developed the household role of keeping track of which tile went where during the assembly, sitting cross-legged on a folded blanket with the inventory list her father had written before he died spread across her knees. And Sulo, 6, who was small enough that Karelia was already mostly forgotten, and Minnesota was simply the world, and who had appointed himself official keeper of the kindling box, which was a job he took seriously. Mikael Niskanen had died on a Tuesday in March of 1885 in the small brick house attached to the south end of his stove yard, of what the doctor in Tampere had called consumption, and what Aino, who had nursed him through the last 14 months, had simply called the disease that takes brickmen. He had been 44. He had spent 22 years building kakalugna for the bourgeois families of Tampere and Tampella and the country estates of the Southern Lake District. And he had served his apprenticeship under a master from Stockholm, whose own master had served under one of Kronstedt's later assistants. He had known, by tactile experience and not by formal study, every detail of how a glazed tile, slow-release stove ought to be built and tuned. And he had begun, in the winter before he died, to write his knowledge down in a thick notebook in his own crabbed Finnish hand, on the chance that one of his children would someday have use for it. He had filled 48 pages with diagrams, dimensions, glaze formulas, draft calculations, common errors and their corrections, and the small 1,000 pieces of practical wisdom that a master accumulates over 22 years, and never quite manages to teach an apprentice in any one sitting. The notebook had crossed the Atlantic in the lining of Aino's winter coat, sewn between two layers of wool by Mikael's sister Helmi in the week before they sailed. It was the most valuable object Aino owned. Vilho knew it was there. The children had been told, with the calm seriousness Aino brought to every conversation about their father, that the notebook was theirs as much as the stove was theirs, and that one of them, when the time came, might want to learn to read it the way an apprentice reads a master's notes, not as a book, but as a working drawing. The stove yard in Tampere had been Mikael's father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. Aino had grown up in a different place entirely, in a small farm in the parish of Ilomantsi, on the eastern Karelian border, where the houses were log and the stoves were the great Russian-style pechka that took up a quarter of the main room and had a sleeping shelf on top, where the smallest children slept on the worst nights of January. She had met Mikael in 1865, when she had come down to Tampere with her father to look at a brick kiln, the family farm having lost most of its grown rye to frost that summer, and her father, who was a careful man, having decided to spend the winter learning a trade that might support the household if the weather went the same way the following year. She had been 24. Mikael had been 26 and had taken over his father's yard the previous winter, and had been polite to her father in the methodical way that brickmen were polite to their customers, and had not said a single word to her until the third afternoon when he had asked her, with the slight formality he kept for women he did not yet know, whether she could read the runic marks on the timber stacked in the corner. She had read them aloud, easily, the way her grandfather had taught her, and Mikael had looked at her for a long moment, and then had gone back to talking to her father about firebrick. 3 months later, he had ridden up to Ilomantsi alone, on a borrowed horse, to ask her father's permission for the engagement. The marriage had been a happy one, in the steady, undemonstrative way that Karelian marriages were happy. Mikael had been a thorough man, careful with money and patient with children, and he had treated his wife the way he treated his clay, with a respect for the material and an unshakable expectation that good work, applied steadily over time, would produce something worth having. They had buried 2 children in infancy, a girl in 1871 and a boy in 1875, and had raised the 3 who lived. Aino had kept the books for the stove yard from the year of her marriage. She knew, by the time her husband died, almost as much about the running of the trade as he had known himself. She did not, however, know how to build a kakaloon. That she had learned in the long autumn and winter of 1886 and the spring and summer of 1887, on the rise above the Vermilion River, working from Mikael's notebook and from the memory of every casual remark he had made over 20 years of evenings at their kitchen table. The Tower settlement in 1886 was not a finished place. The Vermilion Iron Range had been opened to mining only 4 years earlier. The railroad from 2 harbors had reached the Sudan workings in the summer of '84 and was being pushed on toward Tower itself, and the population of the town and the surrounding claims had grown by something like 900 souls in 2 years, mostly Finns, Swedes, and Norwegians, with a scattering of Cornishmen brought up from the copper country in Michigan to work as captains in the new shafts. The country around Tower was hard pine forest, punctuated by lakes and broken granite outcrops, the soil thin and acid in most places, and good only in narrow strips along the river bottoms. The growing season was short. The winters were long enough and cold enough that the older Finns, who had grown up in Karelia or Savo or Pohjanmaa, said openly that Minnesota was not, in fact, colder than the old country, only colder in a sustained way that did not break for the same kind of thaws. The country was strange enough that even an immigrant familiar with hard winters had to relearn what a hard winter meant. Aino's claim sat on a rise of mixed jack pine and white birch, about 2.5 miles up the South Fork from where the wagon road forked east toward the Mäkinen and Tuomi properties. The land had been claimed by a Swedish miner who had taken sick and gone back to St. Paul in the spring of '85, and the agent in Duluth had been pleased to have a buyer for the claim, transfer fee, and the back taxes. Aino had paid in coin from the sale of the Tampere yard, which Mikhail's brother Erkki had bought from her at a reduced price, and she had walked the property with Vilho on a morning in early May, and had decided by the second hour that the rise on the south side of the small clearing was where the cabin would stand, and the kakaloon would stand inside it, against the north wall, with its smoke leaving the roof through a chimney of locally fired brick that would be the second piece of masonry she would have to learn how to build. She had hired a Finnish carpenter named Aino Niskanen, recently arrived from Pohjanmaa, to raise the log walls of the cabin in late May, and she had paid him in coin and in 2 of the 4 hens she had bought in Tower. The cabin was 24 feet by 16, with a sleeping loft above the main room for the children, a packed earth floor that she would lay floorboards over the following spring. 2 small south-facing windows of glass she had brought up from Duluth, packed in straw, and a single door on the east side. Salminen had told her, while he worked, that she would do better to build the chimney first and let the cabin take shape around it. She had thanked him for the advice and had not taken it, because Michael's notebook had been very specific on the order in which a kakaloon installation should proceed, and the chimney came after the firebox and the lower courses of tile, not before. By the time the walls were up and the roof was on, the autumn was already deepening, and she had begun the laying of the firebox in the 2nd week of September, on a foundation of granite fieldstones that Vilho had hauled by hand from the broken outcrop 100 yards north of the cabin. The firebox was the heart of the stove, the small enclosed chamber where the wood actually burned, lined with refractory brick that she had ordered specifically from Duluth at a cost that had made her wince, but had not made her hesitate. A kakaloon that economized on fire brick at the lining was a kakaloon that would crack in its first winter, and 20 years of Michael's evening remarks at the kitchen table had made that particular fact very clear. The firebox was small by the standards of an American cast-iron stove, perhaps 18 inches across and 20 deep, with a cast-iron door that she had ordered from a foundry in St. Paul, also at an expense she had carefully written into her household book. What separated a kakaloon from a common stove was not the firebox. It was what happened to the smoke after the smoke left the firebox. In a common cast-iron stove, of the kind Eric Tuomi sold at his establishment, and that nearly every cabin in the Tower settlement now used, the smoke went up from the firebox, directly through a sheet metal pipe and out the roof. The hot gases, carrying perhaps 3/4 of the heat the wood had produced, departed the cabin in less than 3 seconds and warmed the sky. A cast-iron stove warmed the air around it briskly and well, but the heat it produced was the heat of the flame in the moment, and when the flame went out, the warmth went out shortly after. There was no reserve, There was no storage. The metal itself held perhaps half an hour's worth of warmth, and then was as cold as the air around it. A kakaloon did something else entirely. The smoke, instead of going directly up, was forced by the geometry of the internal flue works to travel a long, winding path through the body of the stove before it reached the chimney. In Cronstedt's original drawings of 1767, that winding path was a series of vertical channels, rising and descending alternately, like the back of a comb laid flat, so that the hot gases entering the stove from the firebox were obliged to climb to the top of the stove, descend through a parallel channel, climb again, descend again, and only then exit through a single port near the floor of the stove into the chimney itself. The total length of that winding path inside a properly built kakaloon was somewhere between 16 and 22 feet, depending on the size of the stove and the design of the channels. 16 feet of close, deliberate contact between extremely hot smoke and the tile and brick mass of the stove body. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it was, in a well-built kakaloon, no warmer than the temperature of a hot summer afternoon. The bulk of the heat that had left the firebox had been deposited, foot by foot, into the masonry as it traveled. What that meant, in practical terms, was that the stove, taken as a whole, was an enormous heat storage device disguised as a piece of furniture. The exterior tile surface, which a visitor might see and admire and consider decorative, was the radiating face of a thermal reservoir. Behind that face stood somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds of fired clay tile and brick, brought up to temperature by the long, winding path of the smoke, and then radiating that stored warmth outward into the room at a slow, steady, patient rate that did not depend on the firebox being lit. The fire might burn for 2 hours in the morning and another 2 hours in the evening, and the stove, the entire stove, the body of it, the soul of it, would hold and radiate the heat of those 4 hours of burning for the full 24 hours of the day, and would still be warm to the touch when the morning fire was rebuilt. Vilho understood this in the abstract by the time they began the lower courses of tile. He had read parts of his father's notebook, slowly, in the long evenings when his sister Lisa held the lamp, and his mother helped him with the words he did not know. And he had reached the point where his sense of the kakaloon was no longer the sense of a strange thing his mother was building for unknown reasons, but the sense of a particular machine with a particular purpose. He had grown up hearing his father use the word kakaloon the way other men used the words plough or anvil. He had not understood at 7 and at 9 and at 11 that his father had been one of perhaps 300 men in the Russian Empire who could build one. He had not understood that the tiles his father glazed on Saturdays were the visible face of an inheritance that ran back through a master in Tampere to a master in Stockholm, to the drawings of Carl Johan Cronstedt, and from there to the slow, accumulated cleverness of 200 years of Scandinavian work with clay and brick and the careful management of fire. He understood it now, at 12, by a route he would not have wished. His father was buried in Tampere. The notebook was on the trestle table at his mother's elbow. The tiles were stacked against the north wall under their canvas, and he was the one who would hand his mother the first tile of the first course, and he was the one whose father had marked that tile with the small runic number that meant first row, second tile from the corner, In the old hand his grandmother had taught his father, in a kitchen Vilho had never seen. The week they began the tile laying was the 3rd week of September, 1886. The mornings were cold enough that the bucket of slaked lime mortar Aino had mixed the night before would skin over by dawn, and she would have to break the skin with the trowel before she could work. The afternoons were warm enough that she had to wet down the fire brick before bedding it, so the brick would not pull moisture from the mortar before the bond had set. Vilho's role was to bring her each tile in the order Lisa called out from the inventory list, and Lisa's role was to read out the runic number on the back of the next tile, from the diagram their father had drawn on the inside cover of the notebook. And Aino's role was to take the tile from Vilho's hands without looking at it, set it into its bed of mortar against the previous tile in the course, check the alignment by eye against the iron straightedge she had clamped to the firebox surround, and tap the tile once with the wooden handle of her mason's hammer to seat it. They worked from sunrise to early afternoon every day that the weather allowed. The first course was the slowest, because the first course set every alignment for the rest of the stove. A single tile placed 1/16 of an inch out of true in the first course would, by the 17th course at the top of the stove, accumulate to 1 1/4 inch of error, and the 1 1/4 inch would mean that the top of the stove would not meet the ceiling beam where the chimney would penetrate, and the whole work would have to come apart and be redone. Aino did not hurry. She placed the first tile at 9 in the morning on the 2nd Tuesday of September, and the last tile of the first course at noon on the following Thursday. 22 tiles, 6 feet of bedded earthenware, a day and a half of patient, slow placement. Vilho did not complain. He had not complained about any task his mother had given him since the spring his father had died, and he was not about to begin now. The second course went faster, the third faster still, and by the 2nd week of October they had reached the level of the cast iron flue plates that defined the lower turning of the smoke channel, and Aino had stopped the tile work to install the iron and the fire brick of the internal flue works. The flue plates had come from a foundry in Helsinki, where Mikael had ordered them 4 months before he died, and Helmi had shipped them with the rest of the disassembled stove from Tampere in the summer of '86. They were cast in 3 pieces, each weighing perhaps 30 pounds, and they slotted into channels in the fire brick that Aino had bedded the previous afternoon. The plates defined the geometry of the smoke path. They were the part of the kakaloon that did the actual work of forcing the hot gases through their winding journey, and they were the part of the kakaloon that most distinguished a kakaloon from an ordinary masonry stove. Aino set them with the same patient, slow care she had brought to the tiles. Mikael's notebook was open beside her, on a folded blanket on the packed earth floor. Lisa held the lamp because the cabin was dim under the canvas roof tarp they had not yet replaced with proper shingles, and the autumn light was already failing by 3 in the afternoon. Vilho watched. There was a moment in the 2nd week of October, on a Thursday afternoon, when the wind from the northwest had begun to carry the first real smell of winter, that Aino realized she had reached the section of the assembly her husband had completed last in his own workshop, the section he had been working on when the cough that had turned into the disease that took him had finally forced him to stop working with his hands. The tiles of the upper left quadrant of the stove front, 12 glazed earthenware squares of a particular dust rose color that he had matched to the green of the lower courses with the careful eye of a man who had spent 20 years getting that match right, were the last tiles he had marked with his soot and fish glue ink. The small runic numbers on their backs were in a slightly different hand from the numbers on the earlier tiles. The hand was looser, less steady. The lines of the runic figures were not as crisp. He had marked these tiles in the last week of February 1885, 3 weeks before he died. He had not had the strength by that point to press the brush firmly to the unglazed clay. Aino took the first of those 12 tiles from Vilho's hands and held it for a moment longer than usual before she set it. Vilho, who had been crouched on his heels with the next tile already lifted, watched her hold his father's last work and then place it carefully into the bed of mortar with the runic number turned inward, where no one would ever see it again once the stove was finished. He set down the tile in his hands. He stood up. He walked past his sister Lisa, who lifted the lamp slightly to follow him without saying anything, and he opened the cabin door and went outside. The afternoon was cold enough that his breath went white in the air. He did not have a coat on. He walked across the dooryard to the broken granite outcrop where he had hauled the foundation stones a year before, and he stood there for some minutes with his back to the cabin and his hands shoved into the pockets of his trousers, and the small fragment of glazed tile that was always in his right pocket, a thumbnail-sized piece of his father's last firing, broken off the corner of a sample tile in the move from Tampere, and kept by him since the day they had unpacked the crates at Duluth, pressed between his thumb and his forefinger so hard that the edge of the glaze cut the pad of his thumb, and a small bead of blood welled up against the dust-rose surface. Aino set 3 more tiles into the wall while he was outside. She did not call him back. When he came back in, after perhaps 10 minutes, his face was wet and his hands were red with cold, but he did not say anything, and his mother did not say anything. She lifted the next tile from the pile beside her and held it out to him in the gesture she used when she wanted him to hand her a tile from the floor, and he took it from her hand and gave it to her, and they continued. Lisa, who had not lowered the lamp, lowered it now, and turned the next page of the inventory list and called out the runic number of the next tile in a voice that was steady and exact. Sulo, who had been asleep on a folded sheepskin behind the kindling box, did not wake up. That evening, after the children were in bed in the loft, Aino sat on the small bench beside the unfinished kakalung and worked her hands open and closed against the chill that had set into her fingers from the day's tile work. She did not light a second lamp. She sat in the dim glow of the small fire she had built in the firebox to test the draft on the lower flue, and she watched the smoke go up the way Mikhail had said it would go, slowly climbing the first vertical channel of the smoke path with the steady, patient lift of properly designed draft. And she did not weep, because she had done her weeping in the 1.5 years since her husband had died, and she did not have any of it left for the small, ordinary moments. She sat and watched the smoke and listened to the cabin settle around her in the cold, and she thought about her son, who had walked out into the dooryard without a coat and had stood by the granite outcrop holding his father's last, broken tile. And she understood, in the way a Karelian woman understood things she had not been told, that the kakalun she was building with her hands and her son's hands and her daughter's eyes was the only memorial Aino Niskanen was going to have on this side of the Atlantic, and that it was, in its own way, a good one. The first hard frost of that autumn came on the 3rd of October, 1886, 3 weeks before the tile work was complete. The men at Tuomi's store had begun their winter habits, gathering on the porch in their fur-lined coats and exchanging the careful, ritual remarks that frontier men exchange when the temperature drops below a certain threshold, and the question of who has wood and who does not begins to have weight. Eric Tuomi had logged the morning low in the small ledger he kept near the till, in which he recorded the daily temperature and the daily turnover of his store, for reasons he would not have been able to articulate, but which had something to do with his sense of order. The 3rd of October had read 14 degrees above zero at dawn. By the 15th, the low was 3 above. By the end of October, the lows were running below zero for the first time, and the men on the porch were beginning to remark, with the particular tone that older Finns reserved for the Minnesota climate, that this year was shaping into something serious. Halvor Tollefsen, the Norwegian lumberman who held the claim adjoining Aino's to the north, had stopped his sledge at her fence line one morning in late October and had looked across at her cabin and at the half-finished kakelun visible through the open door, and had said to himself, audibly enough for his hired man to hear, that the widow Niskanen had built a china doll's stove for an Iron Range winter, and that the country had a way of educating people on what was decorative and what was not. The hired man, who was a young Finn from Vasa named Toivo Lahtinen, had not laughed, because Toivo had been raised by a grandmother who had remembered a pacemer in her own grandmother's house outside Vasa, and he was not entirely certain that the widow's stove was as decorative as Halvor was suggesting. But he had not contradicted his employer, because hired men did not contradict employers on the Iron Range in 1886, and he had filed the question away, the way Arpo Heikkilä had filed Eric Tuomi's remark, for later use, when the country itself would do the contradicting. By the 2nd week of November, the kakelun was finished. The last tile, on the upper right corner of the stove front, went into its bed of mortar on a Tuesday afternoon, in a flurry of light snow that had been falling since dawn. Aino set it. She tapped it once with the wooden handle of her mason's hammer. She stepped back. Vilho stepped back beside her. Lisa, who had been holding the inventory list across her knees for 9 weeks, closed the list and laid it on top of the notebook on the trestle table. Sulo, who had been told the previous evening that today might be the day, climbed up onto the bench by the door to see the whole stove from the proper distance. The kakelun stood 7 feet tall against the north wall of the cabin, 6 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, with its green and dust-rose tiles arranged in the pattern Mikael had drawn 40 years before in his apprentice notebook in Tampere, and had perfected over 22 years of stove work, and had completed, in the marking of the last tiles, in the last week of February of his life. The mortar would cure for 10 more days. Then she would light the first proper fire. The first proper fire of a new kakelun was not a casual matter. The masonry of the stove, taken as a whole, contained somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 gallons of water, bound up in the lime mortar and the green fire brick, that had not yet been thoroughly heated. If that water were converted to steam too rapidly by an aggressive first fire, the steam would force its way out through the seams between the tiles, and the seams would crack, and a kakelun with cracked seams was a kakelun that would never reach its design performance. The first fire had to be small. The second fire, the next day, slightly larger. The third, larger still. Over the course of about 10 days of progressively larger fires, The water in the mortar would be driven out gently, the masonry would shrink to its final dimensions, and the seams would settle into the condition in which they would stay for the working life of the stove, which Mikhail had once told her, in a remark she had filed away without then knowing why, would be at least 100 years if the stove were properly tended. She lit the first fire on the morning of the 22nd of November. The flame consumed perhaps half a stick of dry birch and went out in 20 minutes. The cabin did not warm noticeably. Vilho watched her bank the small remains of the fire and close the firebox door, and he asked her, with the slight formality he sometimes used when he wanted to seem older than 12, when she thought the stove would actually start to warm the cabin. She told him, in about 10 days, and not really for another 2 weeks after that. He nodded. He went out to bring in more kindling for the next morning's fire. By the time the first real freeze of December came, the cabin was warm. The kakaloon was holding the heat of 2 small daily fires through every 24-hour cycle, and the interior temperature of the cabin, which Aino measured every morning and every evening on the small German thermometer hanging on the nail in the tile face, was running between 62 and 68 degrees, with 2 firings per day of perhaps an hour and a half each. The Mackinnons, whom she had not yet met, were running their cast-iron stove around the clock and burning roughly twice the amount of wood per day, and were holding their cabin at 55 degrees. Eric Tuomi, 4 miles south, at the general store, was burning a winter's worth of cordwood at his usual pace and was holding his small stove room at 60 degrees by feeding the stove every 2 hours from rising to bed. He had not yet noticed that the smoke from the chimney on the rise above the south fork of the Vermilion went up perhaps 3 times a day and not more, and that when it did go up, it went up grey-white and thin, the way smoke goes up from a fire that has burned cleanly and given most of its heat to the masonry behind it before reaching the flue. The 3rd of January 1888, the temperature at Tuomi's store stood at 18 degrees below zero. Eric logged it. Halvor Tollefson, who had ridden in for a sack of flour and a tin of black tea, looked at the ledger over Eric's shoulder and said something to the effect that the country was warming up to its proper winter. Eric agreed. Outside, the smoke from the chimney on Aino Niskanen's rise was a thin, straight line, going up 200 yards into the still, hard blue sky. And the porch thermometer was beginning, although no one would say so until later, to fall toward a number that would put the Iron Range and the families that had made their homes on it into the kind of week that nobody on the porch had yet learned to imagine. She woke at 4:30 on the morning of the 4th of January and lay for a long time in the dark without moving. The cabin was quiet. The children were asleep in the loft. The kakaloon against the north wall was holding 70 degrees in the air at the level of her bed, 12 hours after the last firing, and the small glow of the firebox lid, where she had banked the coals before sleeping, was a steady, dim red. She could hear nothing of the wind because there was no wind. There was only the cold outside the cabin and the warmth inside it, separated by 12 inches of wall and the heavy, quilted curtain she had hung over the door, and the 17 feet of vertical mass that ran from the firebox floor to the ceiling beam in the kakaloon against the north wall. If you have found yourself, perhaps in the small hours of your own morning, drawn to accounts of practical wisdom that crossed an ocean in a notebook and a coat lining and held its weight when the cold came to test it, please make sure to subscribe. We have more documented stories of widows and the dwellings they built with their hands, and the long, patient lineages of skill that traveled quietly across centuries and oceans. And they are worth the time to recover. She got up. She dressed without lighting the lamp, because she knew the cabin by feel and saw no reason to spend kerosene on a routine she could do in the dark. She added 2 short lengths of dry birch to the firebox and adjusted the damper to a slow burn, and put the kettle on the small iron plate set above the firebox opening for that purpose. Then she sat down at the trestle table with Mikhail's notebook open to a section she had read 70 or 80 times and had taken to reading anyway in the mornings of January, because it was a habit, and because the cabin was quiet, and because the notebook in his hand was as close to his company as she was likely to come on this side of anything. The section she was reading that morning concerned the management of a kakaloon during what Mikhail had called the deepest cold, by which he meant the kind of sustained low temperature that did not break for thaws and gave the stove no recovery time between firings. His notes on the subject were brief, because the deepest cold did not, in his experience in Tampere, often last longer than a few consecutive days. He had written, in his careful hand, that during such periods the firings should be reduced in size, but not in frequency, that the firebox should be allowed to come down to coals between firings rather than going out entirely, and that the damper should be left slightly more open than usual to keep a steady, slow draft moving through the smoke channels, which would maintain the temperature of the upper masonry without driving water out of any seams that might still be settling. The notes were 2 paragraphs long. They were sufficient. Aino read them through twice. She closed the notebook. She drank her coffee. She watched the firebox glow and the kettle steam and the small fragments of grey-white birch ash settling on the cast iron plate at the bottom of the firebox. And she thought about Vilho, who had turned 13 in November and had begun to grow into his shoulders in a way that would have pleased his father. And about Lisa, who had taken over the keeping of the household accounts in a child's careful hand. And about Sulo, who had stopped speaking Karelian almost entirely and now even thought, she suspected, mostly in English. She thought about the Tampere yard, which she had not seen now in the better part of 2 years, and about Mikhail's brother Erkki, who had written her in October with the news that the brick supplier they had used for decades had gone bankrupt, and the fire brick trade in southern Finland was passing into the hands of a single Tampella-affiliated outfit that he did not trust. She thought about the Mackinons, whom she had finally met at the church gathering in Tower in November, and whom she had not yet visited, and about Aili Mäkinen, the 3-year-old, who had been coughing the tight, dry cough Aino's own daughter had coughed in the winter of 1876, and who had survived because Aino had kept her in a corner of the warm kitchen beside the pechka for 3 weeks straight. The cough had a name in medical books that Aino could not have spelled. The name did not matter. What mattered was the warmth and the constancy of it. She thought about the porch thermometer at Tuomi's store, which had read 18 below at dawn on the 3rd, and which she expected, although she had no way of knowing for certain, would read lower on the 4th and lower still on the 5th. The cold of the deepest sort had a particular quality of arrival that she had learned to recognize in Karelia. It came in without wind and without weather. It simply arrived, the way an army arrived in a province it had decided to occupy. And it settled, and it did its work, and it left when its work was done. There were no portents. There was only the air itself, which became more refined, more silent, less generous with the small daily exchanges of warmth between any one object and another, until at the end the air was so depleted of any thermal kindness that the difference between the inside of a cabin and the outside of a cabin became, in effect, the difference between two different planets. The next firing of the kakaloon was scheduled for 9 in the morning. She made breakfast for the children at 7. By 8, Vilho had brought in the day's wood and stacked it in the small wooden crib by the firebox, in the order Mikael had specified for cold weather firing, which was a tight stack of split birch with the bark side out for clean burning. Smaller pieces toward the front, larger toward the back. By 9, the temperature outside, as recorded by her own thermometer on the north wall, was 23 degrees below zero. She fired the stove. The wood burned cleanly for an hour and a half and went to coals. She closed the damper. The cabin held 71 degrees at noon. By the time she fired the stove again, at 4 in the afternoon, the cabin had dropped to 68. Outside, the thermometer had fallen to 29 below. 4 miles south, Erik Tuomi closed his store at 5 in the afternoon because the porch was so cold that the customers had stopped coming, and the few who did appear in the doorway needed only to be served their tobacco or their tin of coffee, and were back on the road within 5 minutes, unwilling to linger and unable to stop for conversation. Erik went into the small back room of the store, where he lived alone in the years since his wife had gone back to Pottery with their 2 grown sons, and he built a fire in the small cast-iron stove that heated the room, and he ate a bowl of cabbage soup and a piece of dark bread, and he wrote the day's temperature in the ledger and went to bed at 7:30 in his wool coat and his felted boots. The fire in the stove burned for 2 hours and went out. By midnight, the small room was 36 degrees. By dawn on the 5th, it was 24 degrees, and Erik woke to the realization that his breath was visible at 6 inches, and that he had not slept more than an hour at a stretch all night. Halvor Tollefsen, on his claim adjoining Aino's to the north, had begun the cold spell with what he believed to be a generous supply of wood. He had been a lumberman in southern Norway in his youth, and he had laid in his winter cordwood the way a man who has been a lumberman lays it in, which is to say, he had laid in roughly twice what he calculated he would need, and had stacked it under canvas with the bark outward and the cut ends sheltered from the wet. By the morning of the 5th, when the porch thermometer at Tuomi's read 34 below at sunrise, Halvor was running through cordwood at a rate that he calculated, with the methodical attention to numbers he brought to most things, would exhaust his supply on the morning of the 12th if the cold did not break. His cabin, well built by his own hands and the hands of his hired man, Toivo Lahtinen, in the summer of '84, held at 51 degrees during the day with the stove burning hot, and dropped to 38 at dawn with the fire down to coals. He slept on a pallet beside the stove, with his wife and his 3 children all in the same room, the bedroom door closed against the cold air of the unheated north end of the cabin. Toivo Lahtinen, who slept in the small lean-to off the south wall, slept in his wool overcoat and his boots, and woke at 3 each morning to add wood to the stove in the main cabin, to keep his employer's family from freezing in their sleep. The Niskanen claim lay 8 miles south of Aino's Rise, along the wagon road that ran east from Tower toward Embarrass and the lakes beyond. Antti Niskanen had come from Vasa in '85 and had married Helmi, a Pottery girl, on the Iron Range in the spring of '86. They had Eily, who was 3, and a 6-month-old boy named Eero, and their cabin was a small one-room structure of squared logs that Auntie had built quickly the previous summer in order to meet the residence requirement on his claim. The chinking was the standard mud and hay mixture, pressed thin into the gaps between logs, and the stove was a small cast-iron box of the kind sold by Eric Tuomi for $8.75, including freight from Duluth. By the 5th of January, Auntie had burned through his stacked cordwood and had begun splitting fence rails. By the 6th, he had begun splitting the rails from the small pasture fence on the north side of his property, which he had built the previous summer to keep his 2 milk cows from wandering into the trees. The cows were now in the small lean-to barn that he had built against the north wall of the cabin, sharing it with the half-dozen chickens that had survived the autumn, and the smell of the barn came through the unsealed gaps in the north wall of the cabin and mixed with the smell of the smouldering pine that Auntie was burning at a rate of perhaps 3 armloads an hour, and which was not, in any meaningful sense, heating the cabin. Helmi Niskanen sat in the rocking chair near the stove, with Eily wrapped in 2 wool blankets in her lap. The child was coughing, the dry, tight cough that had been her permanent companion since the 2nd week of December, and the cough had begun, in the last 48 hours, to take on a wet quality at the bottom that Helmi recognized from her own mother's dying winter in Pottery in 1873. Auntie split rails until his hands were too cold to grip the maul, and then he came inside and warmed his hands at the stove until he could grip again, and then he went back out. He did this in alternating cycles of about 20 minutes for the entire daylight hours of the 5th and the 6th and the 7th. The temperature outside continued to fall. By the morning of the 8th, the porch thermometer at Tuomi's read 38 below, and Eric had stopped opening the store entirely and had retreated to the back room with all his blankets and his lamp oil and his old Bible. By the morning of the 10th, the thermometer read 40 below, and the men along the wagon road who had any sense of weather were beginning to realize that this was not a cold snap, but something rarer and more dangerous. What the older Finns at the gathering in Tower in November had called, by a word that did not translate easily into English, the dead air, an Arctic mass parked over the upper Midwest without movement or convection, slowly draining the warmth from every structure within reach. I have stood in the back room of the old Tuomi store, which still exists, although the front of the building has been remodeled twice and the porch has been replaced. The back room is much as it was. The single small window is set high in the north wall. The brick of the chimney is the same brick. The plank floor is the same plank floor. It is not a difficult thing to imagine an aging shopkeeper sitting in his wool coat in that room at 3:30 in the morning with the thermometer outside reading 40 below and the inside of his window opaque with frost, and the small cast-iron stove burning hard against a cold that did not yield to it. The ledger in which Eric Tuomi logged the temperatures of those 9 days is held in the Sibley House archives at Mendota. The pages for the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th of January 1888 read in succession: -38, -40, -41, -42, -42. What the records do not say, because records of that kind do not say such things, is what those temperatures felt like inside the cabins where men and women had been fighting them for 8 days running. Halvor Tollefsen had stopped speaking to Toivo Lahtinen except to give instructions. The Mäkinens had begun, on the night of the 11th, to take turns sitting up by Eili to make sure the child's breathing did not stop in the small hours when the fire was lowest and her cough was at its worst. Erik Tuomi had stopped eating meals because the effort of chewing in a 30-degree room was more than he wanted to spend. The schoolhouse in Tower had been closed since the 5th, when the schoolmaster, a young man from St. Cloud named Joseph Erlandson, had walked through the door of his rented room above the livery stable and had found the water in his wash basin frozen solid, and had decided that further attempts at instruction were not warranted until the weather changed. Up on the rise above the south fork of the Vermilion, Aino Niskanen was firing her kakaloon twice a day at 6 in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon, in the careful, slow firings of perhaps an hour and 3/4 each. And the cabin was holding between 69 and 73 degrees throughout the cold spell. She was, by her own quiet calculation, burning roughly a third of the cordwood Halvor Tollefsen was burning a mile north, and roughly a fifth of what Antti Mäkinen was burning 8 miles south, and her cabin was 12 to 15 degrees warmer than either of theirs at any hour of any day. The children went barefoot on the packed earth floor in the mornings. Vilho read the section of his father's notebook on cold weather firing 2 or 3 times a day, partly because his mother had asked him to learn it, and partly because he was beginning to feel, in a way he could not yet articulate, that the notebook was his to learn from now, and not merely his mother's. Sulo, who was 6, had developed the habit of putting his bare hands flat against the tile face of the kakaloon in the morning to warm them before breakfast. The tiles were warm, but not hot. He could leave his palms against them for as long as he wanted. He had taken to a small game in which he pressed his hand against a green tile and counted slowly to 20, and then withdrew his hand and pressed it against a dust rose tile and counted to 20 again, comparing the two warmths in some private system of judgment that he did not share with anyone, but that satisfied him. Lisa, who at 9.5 had taken on the morning task of grinding the day's coffee from the small store of beans Aino had purchased in November at considerable expense, had begun, in the 3rd week of the cold, to ask her mother questions about the smoke channel and the damper management that suggested she was reading sections of the notebook on her own. Aino had answered the questions without commenting on the reading, because it had not been her habit to praise her children for what they were already doing. The mornings of the 11th and the 12th of January, 1888, were the coldest mornings Aino Niskanen had experienced in her time in the United States, and were, by any honest reckoning, the coldest mornings she had experienced in her life. The Karelian winters of her childhood had produced cold of comparable depth, perhaps once a decade, but they had not produced cold of comparable depth, combined with the quality of stillness that had now settled over the Iron Range. In Karelia, there had been wind, there had been thaws, there had been variation. Here, the cold simply sat. It sat for the 3rd day, the 4th day, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and now the 8th. The thermometer on her own north wall read 40 below on the morning of the 12th, and had not risen above 35 below since the night of the 7th. She rose at 6. She added 2 short lengths of birch to the firebox and adjusted the damper for the slow burn she had now settled into as her cold weather pattern. She put the kettle on, She brewed her coffee. She made porridge for the children with rye flour and a small quantity of dried apple. She read the same 2 paragraphs of Mikhail's notebook she had read every morning for 9 days running, partly out of habit, and partly because reading them was a way of consulting her husband on the running of the stove, which was the closest she could come these days to consulting him on anything. The thermometer, at the level of her bed, read 71 degrees. Outside, the thermometer on the north wall read 42 below. The difference between the two numbers was 113 degrees, and every one of them had been built into the 7-foot mass of glazed earthenware tile against the north wall of the cabin by her hands and her son's hands and her daughter's eyes, over 12 weeks of patient work in the autumn before. She finished her coffee. She wiped Lisa's chin where the porridge had dripped. She told Vilho, with the casual matter-of-factness she used for instructions that were not negotiable, to add the next length of birch to the firebox at 9:30, and to check the damper. Then she put on her coat, with the notebook still sewn in the lining, and her wool kerchief, and her felted boots, and her mittens, and she stepped out onto the small porch she had built the previous summer on the south side of the cabin, to take her morning look at the weather and the world. The morning was perfectly clear. The sun was just up above the line of pines on the east horizon and was casting the particular pale, hard light that the sun casts when the air is too cold to hold any moisture. The smoke from her own chimney went straight up into the still air in a thin column that was nearly white against the deep blue of the sky. To the south and the east, she could see the smoke columns from the chimneys of the Niskanen claim 8 miles away, although the columns at that distance were thinner than her own and harder to follow with the eye. She stood on the porch for perhaps 3 minutes. She did not move much because the cold at 42 below was the kind of cold that gave a person 3 minutes of exposed face before something began to happen to the skin. She was about to turn and go inside when she noticed, in the direction of the Niskanen claim, that one of the 2 smoke columns she had been counting on the southern horizon was no longer there. She stood for another moment and looked. She was not certain. The angle was difficult, and the distance was 8 miles, and the morning light was hard on the eyes. But the count of smoke columns to the southeast did not match what she remembered from the previous morning, and it did not match what she had been seeing for the past 9 mornings. And the column that was missing, if her sense of the geography was correct, was the one that should have been coming up from the Niskanen cabin on the wagon road toward Embarrass. She went back inside. She closed the door behind her. She stood for a moment in the warmth of the cabin, considering. Vilho looked up from the firebox where he was about to add the bank of birch she had asked him to add. Lisa looked up from the inventory list she was reading at the trestle table. Aino did not say anything to them for a long moment. She thought about the cough she had heard the Niskanen child making at the church gathering in November. She thought about the 3 years of age of that child, which was the same 3 years of age that Lisa had been in the winter of 1881, when the croup had taken hold of her so hard that Michael had carried her, wrapped in his own wool coat, for the half-mile of frozen road from their house in Tampere to the doctor's office in the small hours of a Sunday morning. She thought about Helmi Niskanen, whom she had liked at the church gathering, who had reminded her of one of her own cousins from Ilomantsi, and about Antti Niskanen, whom she had not formed much of an opinion of, but who had seemed to her to be a man trying very hard at things he did not entirely know how to do. She thought about the soup pot, which was on the small iron plate above the firebox where she did most of her cooking, and which contained the day's barley and salt beef broth, perhaps half full. There was enough for the family's supper, and perhaps slightly more. She took the kettle off the iron plate. She moved the soup pot to the center of the plate, where the heat was strongest. She added 2 cups of water from the bucket by the door, and a handful of dried barley from the tin on the shelf, and a small piece of salt beef from the crock in the corner. She stirred the pot. She put the lid on the pot. She turned to Vilho, who was watching her without yet saying anything, because Vilho had learned, over 13 years, to wait and see what his mother was doing before he asked any questions. She said to him, in Karelian Finnish, that he was to keep the firebox burning slow until she returned, and was to check the damper at 9:30 and again at noon, and that if she had not returned by 3 in the afternoon, he was to take Lisa and Sulo to the Tollefsen claim, which was the nearest cabin to the north, and to ask Halvor Tollefsen for shelter until she came for them. She said it without dramatizing it and without explaining it, because Vilho did not need it explained. Vilho nodded. He said yes. He did not ask where she was going. He asked only whether she would take the small wood sled, and she said yes, she would. He went out to harness the sled without further comment. Lisa had stood up from the trestle table and had brought Aino the wool muffler that hung on the peg by the door. She held it out without saying anything. Aino took it. She wrapped it twice around her neck and pulled the top of it up over the lower half of her face. She added a second pair of woolen mittens over the first pair. She tied the kerchief tighter beneath her chin. She lifted the soup pot from the iron plate. She wrapped it in 2 thicknesses of wool blanket, and then in a sheet of canvas, and she carried it out to the small wood sled, where Vilho had already harnessed the sled to himself, because the family did not own a horse, and the sled was the kind a man pulls behind him by a leather strap across his chest. He did not say anything about going with her. He did not need to. The 2 of them set off down the wagon road toward the Niskanen claim at 8:20 in the morning of the 12th of January, 1888, with the pot of barley and salt beef broth wrapped against the cold on the sled between them. The porch thermometer on Tuomi's store, 4 miles south, reading 42 below zero, and not yet at its low for the day, and the smoke column from the Niskanen chimney to the southeast no longer visible against the hard, brilliant, depleted blue of the morning sky. 8 miles south of them, on the wagon road toward Embarrass, Antti Niskanen had stopped splitting fence rails at 4 in the morning because he had run out of fence rails. He had then begun, by lamplight, to break apart the small wooden chicken house attached to the south side of his lean-to barn, prying loose the boards with the back of his axe and dragging them inside one by one. Helmi Niskanen had spent the night sitting in the rocking chair by the stove with Aili on her lap, the child's breathing now a continuous, wet rattle that came in short, shallow pulls, and Eero, the 6-month-old, asleep in a basket at her feet under 3 wool blankets. The fire in the cast-iron stove was small because the chicken house boards burned fast and gave little heat, and the air in the cabin at 6 in the morning had fallen to 11 degrees above zero. By 7, when Aino was standing on her porch 8 miles north, the air in the Niskanen cabin was 9 degrees. By 7:30, it was 7. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned through the last of the chicken house boards and had gone out. Antti had walked out to the lean-to barn to begin tearing boards from the south wall of the barn itself, and Helmi had not seen him for 15 minutes. The cold that came through the open door, each time he returned with an armload of boards, had begun to settle into the cabin in a way that the fire, even when it was burning, could no longer reverse. Ailey's cough had stopped being a cough and had become something more like a rapid, labored breathing, punctuated by small, wet sounds at the back of her throat. Helmi was praying in Finnish, very quietly, in the form she had learned from her mother in Pottery, the words rising and falling under her breath in the rhythm of the rocking of the chair. And Ailey's small face against her chest was the colour of skim milk. The Mackinnon's smoke column had gone out at 7:20 in the morning, when the last of the chicken house boards finished burning, and Auntie was still out at the barn, prying loose the south wall. Aino Niskanen had seen the absence of the column at 7:25, when she had stepped out onto her porch with her coffee finished and the morning still ahead of her. The distance between her cabin and the Mackinnon claim was, by the wagon road, 8¼ miles. She and Vilho, pulling the sled at the pace a woman and a strong 12-year-old could pull a sled in 42 below cold, would cover the distance in 2 hours if the road was clear and 3 hours if it was drifted. The road, on the morning of the 12th, was clear because there had been no snow in 9 days. They walked steadily. They did not talk. The sled, with the soup pot lashed to the bed, ran easily on the iron-hard packed snow of the road behind them. They reached the Mackinnon dooryard at 10:22 in the morning. The cabin was visible from the bend in the road a quarter mile back. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was a man visible, very small at that distance, struggling with something at the south wall of a small outbuilding. Aino quickened her pace slightly. Vilho matched her without speaking. They came up the rutted track to the dooryard, and Aino looped the sled rope over the post by the door. And she did not knock. She opened the door of the cabin, and she stepped inside, and Vilho followed her with the pot wrapped in its blankets, and she set the pot on the small cast-iron stove that was no longer burning, and she looked at Helmi Mackinnon in the rocking chair with the child against her chest, and she crossed the 4 feet between the door and the chair, and she put her hand against the side of Ailey Mackinnon's small face. The child was alive. The skin was cold, but not yet the deep cold that meant the body had given up. The breathing was wet and labored, but was still occurring. Aino did not say anything to Helmi for a moment. She turned to Vilho. She said in Karelian that he was to find Auntie and tell him to come inside immediately, and to leave whatever he was doing with the barn. She turned back to Helmi. She said, in Finnish, gentle but not soft, that they were going home with her now, all of them, the child and the baby and Helmi and Auntie, and that they would sort the cabin and the cows and the chickens later, when the air was capable of being lived in, and that the first thing was the child. Helmi looked up at her. Her eyes were not the eyes of a woman who had slept in the last 72 hours. She said, in Finnish, that she did not know whether Ailey could survive the trip. Aino said, in Finnish, that the child would survive the trip because there was no choice, and that she had carried sicker children further in colder weather, which was not entirely true, but was sufficient at the moment, and that the warm soup pot on the cold stove behind her would be on a warm stove of a different kind in 3 hours. Outside, Vilho had reached the lean-to barn. He found Auntie Mackinnon leaning against the south wall of the barn with his axe at his feet and his hands flat against the planks of the wall, holding himself upright with his forearms while he caught his breath. The man was 31 years old. He had not slept in 3 days. His beard was crusted with the white ice of his own frozen breath, and there was a small streak of blood across the bridge of his nose where the cold had cracked the skin. Vilho said, in Finnish, that his mother was inside the cabin and that they were taking the family home with them. Antti looked at the boy. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he picked up the axe, slowly, and he carried it inside the barn and leaned it against the wall. And he came back out, and he followed the boy across the dooryard to the cabin, and he opened the door, and he saw his wife standing now beside Aino Niskanen, with their daughter in her arms, and the older woman with one hand on Helmi's elbow. And he understood, without needing it explained, that he had reached the end of what he could do for his family by his own hands alone, and that another woman had walked 8 miles down a frozen road with a pot of soup at 42 below, and had arrived in time to do what he had not been able to do, and that the only thing left for him at this moment was to nod and to follow her instructions. He nodded. He followed her instructions. By 11 in the morning, the cows were in the lean-to with extra hay. The chickens were in the crate Aino had asked Antti to bring out from the cabin, and were lashed to the back of the sled. The cabin door was closed and bolted, and the family of 4 was wrapped in every wool blanket and quilt and overcoat in the household, and was making its slow way back up the wagon road toward the rise above the south fork of the Vermilion. Aino walked beside the sled with Aili in her arms, inside her own overcoat, against her own warmth. The child's face pressed into the wool at the base of her throat. Helmi walked behind her, with Eero in his basket against her chest, and Antti pulled the sled with the chicken crate and the children's clothes and the soup pot. And Vilho walked alongside Antti to take over the sled if the man fell, which Vilho privately expected him to do. The morning's cold had not yet reached its low. By the time they reached Aino's cabin at 25 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the porch thermometer at Tuomi's store, which they had not passed, but which Aino would learn about later from Eric's ledger, was registering 45 degrees below zero. Vilho opened the cabin door. The wave of warm air that came out of the cabin onto Helmi Mäkinen's face as she stepped through the door was the first thing in 9 days that she had felt that was warmer than her own body, and her knees gave out, and Aino caught her by the elbow, without the soup pot or Aili shifting in her own arms. And she walked Helmi the 4 feet to the chair beside the kakalun and sat her down. And she sat down beside her, with Aili still inside her overcoat against her throat. And she did not say anything for some minutes, while the warmth of the green and dust-rose tiles against Helmi's back began to do what 8 days of cold had not been able to do, which was to stop the shaking that had set into the woman's hands in the long hours before dawn. Antti Mäkinen stood in the doorway with the sled rope still over his shoulder, looking at the kakalun against the north wall, and he did not move for a long minute. The stove stood 7 feet tall in the warmth of the cabin, its green and dust-rose tiles catching the pale winter light from the south windows, and the man who was looking at it had not, in his 28 years of life, seen anything resembling such a thing. He had been raised in Vasa, in a wooden house with a small cast-iron stove. He had assumed, as nearly everyone in the settlement had assumed, that what the widow Niskanen had built was decorative, or at most, a sentimental imitation of an old country thing. He had spent the past 9 days of his life burning everything he could break to splinters in his own cabin in order to keep his own stove burning, and his cabin had still fallen to 7 degrees above zero by the morning of the 12th, and his daughter had stopped responding to the sound of her own name 3 hours before sunrise. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the stove. He looked at his wife in the chair beside it. He looked at Aino Niskanen, who was loosening the wool muffler from around Eileen's small head with the casual, focused care of a woman who had done this exact action many times before, although she had never done it for this child. He understood, in the part of him that did not yet have words for it, that the stove that had been the joke of the settlement for 15 months was now the only thing standing between his daughter and the small graveyard behind the new Lutheran church in Tower. He set down the sled rope. He closed the door behind him. He stood with his back against the closed door, and he watched his daughter beginning, very faintly, to warm. Aino crossed to the trestle table and cut 6 slices of dark rye bread with the broad-bladed knife she kept on the windowsill. She moved the soup pot from the cold cast-iron stove where Vilho had set it to the iron plate above the firebox of the kakaloon. She added a cup of fresh water from the bucket by the door and stirred the pot once with the long wooden spoon. She set out 4 shallow earthenware bowls. She filled a 5th bowl with a small portion of the broth, set it on the trestle table to cool, and brought it to Helmi, with a clean cotton cloth folded in her other hand for the wiping of the child's chin. She did not say anything while she did this. Helmi did not say anything either. And he stood with his back against the closed door for perhaps 2 more minutes, and then crossed the 8 feet of the room to the chair where his wife was sitting, and he crouched down beside her, and he put one hand against the side of his daughter's small head, and he made a small sound at the back of his throat that was not quite a word. Eileen was not yet capable of looking at him. Her eyes were open. The breathing was still wet, but the color at the corners of her mouth was no longer the color of skim milk. Vilho came back inside with an armload of birch from the wood crib by the door, which he laid down beside the firebox in the careful, tight stack his mother had taught him. He glanced at the kakaloon thermometer on the nail in the tile face. He glanced at his mother. He did not say what he had seen. He went back outside to bring in the chicken crate from the sled. Lisa, who had not moved from the trestle table since Aino had come back through the door, had set out the second oil lamp from the shelf behind the kindling box and had lit it, although the cabin was bright enough in the midday sun coming through the south windows. She had lit the lamp because lighting the lamp was something useful to do, and Lisa had been raised to do useful things in moments when she did not yet know what else was required. She brought the lamp to the trestle table and set it beside the bread, and she went to the wood crib to count the day's remaining birch. Sulo, who had been asleep on the folded sheepskin behind the kindling box when his mother had left, and who had woken when the family of strangers had come through the door, sat very still on the bench by the door, with his bare feet drawn up under him on the planks, and his eyes on the small girl in the lap of the woman in his mother's chair. He had been told by his mother some weeks before that Aili Mäkinen was a little girl who lived 8 miles away and who was sometimes sick. He had not yet met her. He was making the calculations a 6-year-old makes about a small sister of comparable size, sitting in a chair he had thought of as belonging to his mother. He had not yet decided what he thought. By 2 in the afternoon, the 8 people in the cabin had eaten the contents of the soup pot, augmented by 2 cups of dried barley and a second piece of salt beef and the second loaf of dark rye Aino had baked the previous morning. Ailey had taken 3 small spoonfuls of the cooled broth from her mother and had swallowed each one and had not coughed in the swallowing, which was the first uncomplicated swallow she had taken in nearly 3 weeks. Eero, the 6-month-old, was asleep in the basket on the floor beside Helmi's chair, his small face flushed pink for the first time in 2 days. Auntie had eaten his bowl of soup and a slice of bread, and had not spoken throughout, and was now sitting on the floor with his back against the south wall of the cabin, with his eyes closed and his hands open in his lap. Helmi began, very quietly, to weep. She did not make any noise about it. The tears went down her face onto the wool of Ailey's blanket and were absorbed there. Aino, who had been adding birch to the firebox for the afternoon firing, did not turn around for a long moment, and when she did not say anything. She came to the chair. She laid her hand briefly on the top of Helmi's head, the gesture a Karelian woman uses for another Karelian woman in such a moment, although Helmi was a Pori woman and not Karelian, and the gesture had not been one she had received in her childhood. She stood there with her hand on the other woman's hair for the count of perhaps 8 breaths. Then she returned to the kakaloon and adjusted the damper for the slow burn she intended for the long afternoon and evening ahead. Rolf Tuomi, who was Eric Tuomi's nephew and a young Finn of 20 who clerked at the store in exchange for room and board, walked up the wagon road from Tower at 4 in the afternoon to ask Aino whether she had any news of the Mackinnons, because Eric had been worried about them since the morning of the 11th and had not been able to ride out in the cold. Rolf reached the dooryard, saw the Mackinnon chickens in their crate against the south wall of Aino's cabin, saw the unfamiliar sled with the wrapped blankets in the dooryard, and understood without going inside. He did not knock. He went back down the road at a pace just short of a run, because the cold was still 42 below, and the run would have frozen the inside of his lungs, and he reached Tuomi's store at 5 and reported what he had seen. Eric Tuomi, who had been sitting in his back room in his wool coat and his felted boots and had been logging the day's temperature for the 9th consecutive day with hands he could barely close around the pen, looked at his nephew and listened to the report and said, in Finnish, that he was a damned fool. He did not specify whom he meant. Rolf, who had grown up with his uncle, understood that the comment was directed at the speaker, and not at the widow Niskanen or the Mackinnons or anyone else in the story, and he did not correct him. I have read Eric Tuomi's ledger for January of 1888 in the Sibley House archives. The pages are brittle. The ink has faded to a pale brown in places. The entry for January 12th, in his careful, Finnish-trained schoolhouse hand, reads in full: dawn -42, noon -38, evening -45. Coldest day of any winter I have logged in 11 years in this country. Mackinnon's taken in by Niskanen's widow up the South Fork. Rolf walked it. Should have ridden it myself 2 days back. He had drawn a small line beneath that entry and had added, in slightly smaller writing, "Damned fool." The notation is unique in his ledger. He did not write such things in his books before that week, and as far as I can determine from the pages following, he did not write such things again. The cold did not break on the 13th. It did not break on the 14th either. The porch thermometer at Tuomi's read -40 on the morning of the 13th and -38 on the morning of the 14th, and the families that had survived the worst of the 11th and 12th by sheer attrition of their fuel supplies were now beginning, as a community, to take stock of what was left. Halvor Tollefsen, on his claim adjoining Aino's to the north, had 2 days of wood remaining if he burned only at the rate that kept his cabin at 35 degrees, which was the lowest temperature his family could endure without immediate harm. Toivo Lahtinen, the hired man from Vasa who slept in the lean-to off the south wall, had not slept in his lean-to since the 7th, and had been sleeping on a pallet in the main room beside the stove. He had begun, on the morning of the 13th, to look at Halvor Tollefsen with a certain quality of expression that was new in their relationship, and that Halvor noticed without commenting on. In the cabin on the rise above the South Fork, 8 people were now living. Aino had given the Mackinens the loft, sending her own 3 children to sleep with her in the main room near the kakaloon, on a pallet she had assembled from the spare straw tick and the wool blankets from the chest by the south window. The arrangement worked because the kakaloon was holding the cabin at 70 degrees through the day and at 68 through the night, and the loft above the main room was holding at 65, the warm air rising to it being trapped under the low ceiling and the bark shingle roof. Aili Mäkinen slept the entire night of the 12th into the 13th, without coughing once. Helmi slept beside her in the same configuration she had used at home, with the child against her chest. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not have to listen for the small, wet sounds at the back of the child's throat between her own slow breaths. And she slept 10 consecutive hours in a way that did something to her face, which Aino, when she saw it the next morning, recognized as the beginning of the return of a younger Helmi from before the cold had begun. By the morning of the 15th, the porch thermometer at Tuomi's read -26 and was rising. The dead air had begun, slowly, to move. A wind from the southwest had come up overnight and was carrying with it the warmth of moist air from the lower Mississippi Valley, and by noon on the 15th, the thermometer was reading -14, which felt to everyone who emerged from their cabins on that day like the first warmth of an early spring. The smoke columns along the wagon road, which had thinned over the course of 9 days to nearly nothing in some claims and to absent in others, began to thicken again as the families fed their fires what they had been husbanding through the worst hours, and the road itself, which had been empty of travellers for the better part of a week, began to show wagon tracks again in the iron-hard snow. Antti Mäkinen and Vilho Niskanen rode the sled down to the Mäkinen claim on the morning of the 16th to assess the cabin and the livestock. They found the cabin standing intact, the cows alive in the lean-to, although thin from the reduced feed of the past week, the chicken house dismantled to the level of the foundation stones, and the south wall of the lean-to barn pried open in 3 places to the depth of the inner boards. Antti did not say anything as he walked through what he had done to his own outbuildings in the small hours of the 11th and 12th. He had not, until this moment, seen the dismantling in daylight. The boards were lying where he had dropped them, frosted into the iron-hard snow, the splinters of his axework showing where he had pried them loose, by lantern, in temperatures that had not allowed him the careful technique he would have used in any other weather. Vilho, who was 13 years old, did not say anything either. He helped Antti load the chickens back into the crate. He helped him close the door of the cabin and bolt it from the outside, with the wooden bar Auntie's own hands had built into the door in the summer of '86. They walked the cows up the wagon road, slowly, taking 3 hours for what had been a 2-hour walk in the other direction, because the cows were thin and the road was still drifted in places where the wind of the 15th had moved the snow. They reached the rise above the South Fork at 3 in the afternoon, and Auntie led the cows into Aino's small lean-to, where she had cleared a corner the previous evening for the 2 animals. By the evening of the 16th, the families had eaten supper together in Aino's cabin. The second supper, Auntie and Helmi had eaten under that roof, and the second supper Auntie had eaten in his life that he had not chewed, in a manner suggesting the next meal was uncertain. He sat at the trestle table beside his wife, and he ate slowly. He did not say anything for most of the meal. Aino Niskanen sat at the end of the table on a folded blanket that raised her enough to reach the bowl in front of her, and she ate her soup with a small spoon Aino had given her, and she did not cough between bites. Aino watched the child eat for some minutes and did not say anything. The cold broke entirely on the 18th. The porch thermometer at Tuomi's read -6 at dawn and +4 by noon, and the country began to remember, with the slight surprise that always accompanies the return of ordinary weather after an extreme event, that -6 was a temperature people lived in routinely and complained about as a matter of course. Eric Tuomi opened the front of his store for the first time in 11 days. He logged the temperature. He noted in the line below the temperature that he had spent the morning sweeping out the front room, and that he would not, even if he were paid in gold, repeat the experience of the past 2 weeks if there were any honest method of avoiding it. He underlined the entry. He went back to selling tobacco. The Niskanens stayed in Aino's cabin for 9 more days. By the time they returned to their own claim on the 27th of January, Auntie had spent 4 afternoons sitting on the bench beside the kakaloon and asking Aino questions about the smoke channel and the firebox lining and the management of the dampers in cold weather firing. He had not at first asked questions about how to build such a stove himself. He had asked questions about how this particular stove worked, the way a man asks about an unusual horse he has met once and does not expect to meet again. By the 3rd afternoon, the questions had shifted in a way that Aino noticed without commenting on. He was now asking about fire brick suppliers, about the cost of glazed tile, about whether a man without 20 years of training in masonry could realistically expect to build a kakaloon that would draft properly and not crack in its first winter. She answered him directly. She told him that a man without 20 years of training could build a kakaloon that drafted properly if he had detailed working drawings, a reliable supply of fire brick, glazed tile fired to the proper temperature, and the patience to lay each course with the care a master would lay it. She told him that she could supply the drawings from her husband's notebook. She told him that the fire brick could be ordered from Duluth at a cost she could quote within 5 cents. She told him that the glazed tile was the difficult part, because the tile she had brought from Tampere was not available locally, and that any tile he commissioned in Minnesota would have to be fired by a local potter who understood the temperature requirements and the glaze chemistry, and that such potters were not common in St. Louis County in 1888. Auntie listened. He nodded at the right moments. On the morning of his departure, he asked Aino whether she would consider letting him pay her in coin or in labor, to teach him the assembly of the stove, if he were to commission the tile himself from a Finnish potter who had set up in tower the previous spring. Aino said she would consider it. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She watched him load his family back onto the sled, with the chickens in their crate and the cows tied behind on a lead line that Vilho had helped him braid from spare leather strapping. And she watched them go down the wagon road toward their own claim. And she went back inside, and she sat at the trestle table, and she opened Mikhail's notebook to the section on tile firing temperatures and glaze chemistry, and she began to copy the section out by hand onto a fresh sheet of paper for Antti Mäkinen. The physics that had governed those 9 days in Aino Niskanen's cabin, while the country around it failed by varying degrees to keep up with the cold outside, were not new physics. They were the same physics that had governed the hypercaust floors of Roman villas in the 2nd century, the warm brick beds of the Mongolian steppe, the heated underplatforms of the Korean ondol, the masonry pechka of the Russian peasantry, the kakalun of Kronstedt's 1767 design. The principle in each case was the same. The fire was a tool. The mass was the heat reservoir. The work of staying warm was not the work of keeping a fire burning continuously. It was the work of heating a large mass of stone or brick or earth and letting the mass do the slow, patient business of radiation in the long hours between firings. A cubic foot of fired earthenware tile, of the kind that made up the body of Aino Niskanen's stove, has a specific heat capacity in the neighborhood of 0.20 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. The stove she had built contained, by my estimate from the dimensions she gave to Antti Mäkinen on the morning of the 27th, somewhere in the region of 1,900 pounds of tile and brick. Heated to a sustained working temperature by the morning and evening firings of seasoned birch she had been giving it through the autumn. That mass held a thermal charge of roughly 12,000 British thermal units per degree of temperature differential between its working temperature and the cabin air. In simple terms, it could deliver continuous warmth into the cabin space at a rate of perhaps 2,000 British thermal units per hour for the better part of 14 hours after the last firing, before the temperature of the mass dropped below the threshold at which it became inadequate. 2 firings a day, properly timed, kept the cabin in the range of 68 to 72 degrees through any cold that the iron range could deliver, including a 45 below cold spell that lasted 9 consecutive days. The cast iron stove in Antti Mäkinen's cabin had, by comparison, perhaps 30 pounds of mass in the body of the stove itself. The mass was not significant enough to act as a reservoir. The heat the stove produced was the heat of the fire in the firebox, transferred to the air around it at the rate of combustion. When the fire was burning hot, the air was warm. When the fire was burning low, the air was cool. When the fire was out, the room was as cold as the room had been before the fire was started, in the time it took the small mass of the cast iron to give up its modest reserve. Antti had not been losing the battle because his stove was a bad stove. He had been losing the battle because his stove was an instrument of one kind, and what he had needed was an instrument of another kind entirely. The British physicist John Tyndall had given a series of public lectures at the Royal Institution in London in the 1860s on the physics of heat, in which he had explained to audiences of educated laymen the principles by which heat moved through and was stored within different materials. Cronstedt's design of 1767 had been arrived at without Tyndall's vocabulary, by the empirical method of a careful architect working with practical builders in a country that had been ordered, by royal decree, to find a way to heat its houses with less wood. The two approaches, the empirical and the theoretical, converged on the same insight. The mass of the stove mattered more than the fire in the stove. The slow release of stored heat mattered more than the immediate output of any flame. What Aino Niskanen understood about her stove, by tactile inheritance from her husband, who had inherited it from his master, who had inherited it from a line of masters running back through Tampere to Stockholm to the original Cronstedt commissions, was not different in any essential way from what John Tyndall could have proved with a sealed glass thermometer and a calorimeter in his laboratory in London. The difference was that Tyndall had proved it as a physical law. Aino had been raised in a culture that had assumed the law for 200 years and had built its houses accordingly. Her neighbors on the Iron Range had been raised in cultures that had not assumed it, or had assumed it, but had not brought the assumption across the ocean with them, or had, in the case of the Norwegians, assumed a different version of it that worked with their own Pisma tradition, but did not translate directly to the urban Swedish kakelung that Cronstedt had designed. The cabin Aino had built was the meeting of three things. It was the meeting of one widow's particular grief, which had focused her attention on her husband's notebook, in a way that grief sometimes focuses attention. It was the meeting of a particular trade lineage which had passed through Tampere from Stockholm, and from Stockholm, from a thin, careful 18th century architect with a thin, careful instrument and a royal commission. And it was the meeting of an Iron Range winter in 1888, which had arrived in its own particular form to test, in the way winters test such things, whether the lineage had survived the crossing. The lineage had survived the crossing. By the spring of 1888, 3 families in the Tower settlement had commissioned tile from the Finnish potter who had set up in town the previous year. A man named Jukka Vuorinen from Lovisa, who had brought a small kiln up from Duluth on the railroad in the spring of '87, and who had been firing local clays for ordinary stoneware and roof tile with modest success. Vuorinen had been skeptical, at first, of his ability to fire glazed kakelun tile to the standards required. Aino had walked into his small workshop in March with Mikael's notebook open to the section on glaze chemistry and the firing temperature curves, and she had sat with him at his trestle for the better part of an afternoon, and she had translated the relevant Finnish into English for his apprentice, an American boy from Duluth, who could read Vuorinen's spoken English but not Aino's written Finnish. By the end of the afternoon, Vuorinen had committed to firing a test run of 12 tiles at the temperature curve Mikael had specified, and to glazing them with a formula Aino had copied out by hand from the notebook the previous evening. The test tiles came out of Vuorinen's kiln on the 4th of April. Aino walked down to Tower with Vilho to inspect them, and she pronounced them acceptable, although she also pointed out 3 small flaws in the glazing that Vuorinen would need to correct for production tiles, which she explained without condescension, and which Vuorinen accepted without offense. By the end of April, Vuorinen had committed to producing the tiles for Antti Mäkinen's stove, and for the stove of a second family, the Lettinens of the Embarrass Road, who had heard about Aino's kakelun from Helmi Mäkinen at the spring social, and had ridden up to the rise on a Sunday afternoon in March to see it for themselves. A third commission came in May from Arpo Heikkilä, the young Finn from Hancock who had been on Erik Tuomi's porch the morning Erik had described Aino's stove as broken pottery, and who had spent the winter thinking about the comment in the way young men think about comments they suspect they should not have taken at face value. Aino agreed, in the end, to teach the assembly of the stoves in exchange for a fee of $15 per installation, payable in coin or in labor at the rate of $1 a day. The $15 was a substantial sum in 1888, but it represented less than the cost of a single fire brick course at Duluth prices, and the families who commissioned the work paid it without complaint. By the autumn of 1888, 3 kakaloons of varying sizes were standing in 3 iron range cabins, drafted properly, drawn from the same notebook Aino Niskanen had filled in the last winter of his life. None of the 3 were as fine as the original on the rise above the South Fork. None of them had been built by hands that had inherited the trade. But all 3 drafted properly, all 3 held heat through the night, and all 3 would, in the next severe winter the Iron Range encountered, do for their families what Aino's had done for hers. The Dekora-Posten, the Norwegian-language newspaper published in Iowa, ran a column in May of 1889 about the Finnish-built kakaloons appearing in the Iron Range settlements. The piece was not long, perhaps 6 column inches, and it was based on a letter the editor had received from a Norwegian-American minister who had passed through Tower in March on his way to a synodal meeting in Duluth, and had spent a Sunday evening in Auntie Mäkänen's cabin, warming himself at the new stove that had been finished the previous autumn. The minister had not known Aino's name, and the column did not include it. It described the stove as a Finnish innovation in cold weather dwelling, and recommended that interested settlers inquire with the Finnish potter at Tower for further information. Vuorinen received 7 inquiries by mail in the 6 weeks after the column appeared. By the spring of 1890, 11 kakaloons were standing in cabins from Tower to Hibbing to the Embarrass Lakes, all of them based on the working drawings Aino had copied out from her husband's notebook in the long afternoons of February and March of 1888. The Minneapolis Tribune reprinted a brief paragraph from the Dekora-Posten column in late May of 1889, on a page given to news from the northern counties. The paragraph described the stove generically as a Scandinavian heat storage device of considerable practical merit, and gave no individual name. Aino did not see the paragraph until the autumn of that year, when Erik Tuomi clipped it from a copy of the Tribune that had come into his store in a bundle of old papers from Duluth, and brought it up the wagon road to her cabin on a Sunday afternoon, with a small jar of his wife's preserved cloudberries that his sister-in-law had sent from Pottery in the September shipment. He set the clipping on the trestle table beside the cloudberries. Aino read it standing, then folded it and handed it back. Her face gave nothing away. Erik watched her, expecting some response, but she only said, in Finnish, that she was grateful for the cloudberries and that her grandmother in Ilomantsi had made cloudberry preserves every September of her childhood. Erik nodded. He stayed for coffee. He did not ask her again about the clipping, which he eventually pasted into the back of his ledger beside the entries for January of 1888, where it remains to this day, brittle and faintly yellowed and legible. Aino lived in the cabin on the rise above the South Fork of the Vermilion for the rest of her life. She did not remarry. She raised the 3 children. Vilho went south to St. Paul at 17 and apprenticed himself to a Finnish stove maker who had set up a small yard in one of the East Side immigrant districts, and he carried his father's notebook with him to that apprenticeship, with his mother's blessing, on the understanding that the notebook would come home with him whenever he chose to come home. He worked his whole life as a stove maker. He built 63 kakaloons between 1893 and 1936, the last one in a private home in St. Paul that still stands. The notebook returned with him to the cabin in 1940, when he visited his mother for the last time in the summer before she died, and it stayed with her on the small shelf beside her bed for the remaining year of her life. Aino Niskanen married a Swedish-Finnish farmer named Emil Koskinen in 1897 and raised 6 children on a claim 10 miles east of Tower. She did not build a kakaloon in her own house because her husband preferred the cast iron stoves he had grown up with, but she taught her oldest daughter to read the runic numbers on the back of her mother's tiles. And that daughter, in turn, taught her own daughter, and the line of women who could read those numbers continued in the family until the 1970s. The last reader was a woman named Aino Koskinen Sundberg, named for her great-grandmother, who in 1976 donated the original notebook, the partial set of replacement tiles that had been kept in the Niskanen family for emergency repairs, and the small leather pouch containing 7 runic-numbered tiles she had inherited from her own grandmother, to the archives of the Finnish-American Heritage Center in Hancock, Michigan. Aino Niskanen never married. He stayed on the rise. He took over the running of the cabin and the small fields his mother had cultivated, and he lived alongside her until her death in 1941, and continued there alone until his own death in 1958. He had grown up putting his bare hands against the warm tiles of the kakaloon every morning before breakfast, and he had never lost the habit. And a photograph taken in 1953 by a researcher from the Minnesota Historical Society shows him at 71, in a worn wool sweater, with his palm pressed flat against a green tile on the south face of the stove. The tile is warm. He is looking at the camera with the small smile of a man who knows what he is doing and is content to have been caught doing it. The cabin and the kakaloon were donated to the St. Louis County Historical Society in 1964, after Sulo's death, by his great-niece Aino Koskinen Sundberg, the same woman who would later donate the notebook to the Hancock Archives. The cabin was moved in 1968 to its current location at the Iron Range Historical Center near Chisholm, where it stands today on a small concrete pad with interpretive signage. The kakaloon was disassembled for the move, tile by tile, by a team that included a Finnish-American mason who had been hired specifically for the work because he was one of perhaps 4 men in the upper Midwest who could be trusted with the operation. The runic numbers on the backs of the tiles, faded but still legible in the soot and fish glue ink that Aino Niskanen had applied in his careful hand in the last winter of his life, served as the assembly diagram. The stove was rebuilt at the Iron Range Center exactly as Aino had built it on the rise in 1886, tile by hands that had nothing to do